The meeting invite hit my calendar at 4:12 p.m. on a Thursday, one of those vague 30-minute blocks labeled Quick Sync. After 17 years, I knew what that meant. No agenda, no prep, no explanation, just a silent tap on the shoulder from the corporate machine telling you your time was up. I still showed up early, tie straight, notebook open, like loyalty might somehow count for something at the finish line. When my boss finally walked in with HR already seated, I didn't feel shocked. I felt insulted. 17 years of weekends, missed birthdays, and crisis calls at midnight, and they couldn't even pretend this was a conversation. They didn't waste time. "We're going in a different direction," she said, eyes glued to the script in front of her. "This decision is effective immediately. No performance issues, no warnings, no transition period." Just a severance packet slid across the table like a tip after bad service. I nodded, thanked them for the opportunity, and stood up calmly while HR looked relieved I wasn't yelling. What they didn't see was the small smile I swallowed on my way out. Because while they thought they were ending a chapter, they had no idea I'd already written the next one. I cleaned out my desk under the watchful eye of a security guard who was probably half my age and made half my salary. Colleagues avoided eye contact, the same people who used to ask me how to fix things they didn't understand. I boxed up 17 years of my life in silence and walked out of the building with my badge deactivated behind me. That's when my phone buzzed, not a sympathy text, not a recruiter, a system alert, external, not internal. One only 3 people in the company were configured to receive, me being one of them. See, what my boss didn't know, what she couldn't have known because she never asked, was that the legacy system she dismissed in meetings was something I'd quietly been maintaining as a contractor add-on for the past 3 years. Fully compliant, fully documented, fully mine. The company had opted not to renew the internal ownership clause during a restructuring 5 years back, a detail legal missed, but I didn't. They asked me to temporarily keep it running while they migrated. Temporary turned into permanent, and permanent turned into leverage. At 6:03 p.m., the alert escalated. A downstream client integration failed, one tied directly to the platform they were showcasing to investors the following morning. By 6:20, my phone was ringing. Unknown number, then another, then another. I let it ring while I drove home, poured a drink, and sat on my porch watching the sun go down like I had nowhere else to be. When I finally answered, it wasn't my boss, it was the CTO. His voice was tight, professional, and just a little panicked. "We need your help," he said. "There's been an unexpected issue." I listened quietly as he explained the outage, the client pressure, the looming deadline. When he finished, I waited a beat and then said calmly, "I'm no longer an employee." Silence, then a hurried pivot. "Of course, we're prepared to discuss a consulting arrangement." I told him my rate. Laughed until he realized I wasn't joking. 17 years of institutional knowledge doesn't come cheap when it's walking out the door, especially when the board is watching. By midnight, the paperwork was signed. By 12:30, the system was stable. By 9 a.m. the next morning, the demo went flawlessly. My former boss smiled on stage, completely unaware she just paid me more in 12 hours than she'd paid me in a year. 2 weeks later, I heard through the grapevine that legal had questions. A month later, she was exploring other opportunities. I didn't celebrate, I didn't gloat. I just updated my LinkedIn title to Independent Systems Consultant and started turning down calls that didn't meet my terms. They fired me without warning, thinking I was replaceable. What they didn't know was that some people aren't assets on a spreadsheet. Some people are the quiet infrastructure holding everything up. And when you remove that without understanding it, gravity does the rest. The email came at 9:07 a.m., subject line neutral, almost polite. Quick sync. After 17 years, that was all it took. No warning, no performance plan, no tense conversations leading up to it. Just a calendar invite dropped into my inbox like a trapdoor. I remember staring at the screen, coffee going cold in my hand, thinking how strange it was that a career could end with something so small. 17 years of late nights, emergency calls, cross-country flights, and missed birthdays, all reduced to a 15-minute meeting with HR copied in. That was when I knew something was wrong. And that was when I realized they had no idea what I knew. I walked into the conference room at exactly 9:30. Glass walls, neutral art, the smell of dry erase markers, and corporate confidence. My boss, Kevin, didn't stand when I entered. He didn't even look uncomfortable. HR was already there, folder open, pen poised. Kevin cleared his throat and launched straight into it, restructuring, changing priorities, difficult decisions. The words were so rehearsed they barely sounded human. He said my role was being eliminated, that they appreciated my contributions, that this had nothing to do with performance. I nodded, calm on the outside, while something settled quietly into place inside me. Because as he spoke, I realized they were making a very expensive mistake. I had joined the company when it was still renting half a floor and calling itself a startup. I built systems that were still running under layers of newer code, systems no one fully understood anymore because no one had bothered to document them properly. Not because I didn't want to, but because every time I asked for time to do it right, leadership said we'd circle back. Over the years, I became the person people called when something broke at 2 a.m., when a client threatened to walk, when a regulator asked uncomfortable questions. I wasn't flashy, I wasn't loud, I just made sure the machine kept working. And somewhere along the way, they stopped noticing that the machine only worked because I was there. Kevin slid the severance agreement across the table. 3 months' pay. A courtesy, he called it. I skimmed it, already knowing I wouldn't need it. I handed over my badge, thanked them for the opportunity, and walked out without a scene. Kevin looked relieved. He thought this was over. He thought I was just another line item removed from the budget. What he didn't know was that 6 months earlier, during one of those circle back later conversations, I had quietly done something else. The company had been preparing for a major compliance audit tied to a new federal reporting requirement. It was complex, technical, and unforgiving, exactly the kind of thing executives like Kevin like to ignore until the last minute. I had warned them repeatedly that our legacy data pipeline wouldn't survive scrutiny. Eventually, tired of being brushed off, I built a parallel compliance framework on my own initiative. I documented everything. I flagged every risk. And when leadership still wouldn't prioritize it, I sent a formal memo outlining the exposure, then archived every response, including the ones where Kevin explicitly declined to act. 2 weeks after I was fired, the audit notice arrived. At first, they didn't panic. They assumed the systems team would handle it. Then they realized I was gone. My phone started lighting up, missed calls, emails marked urgent, calendar invites I declined without comment. By the end of the week, the tone shifted from confident to desperate. The new lead couldn't explain how the reporting logic worked. The consultants they hired billed 6 figures just to tell them what I had already warned them about. The audit deadline loomed closer and the regulators weren't interested in excuses. I finally responded when legal reached out directly. Not to help, just to clarify. I forwarded my original memo. I attached Kevin's response. I highlighted the dates. I wished them luck. The fallout was quiet but devastating. The audit failed. The company was fined. A major client froze their contract pending remediation. And in the next quarterly earnings call, Kevin was suddenly pursuing opportunities elsewhere. No announcement, no celebration, just gone. I found out months later that my old role had been reposted. Same responsibilities, lower salary, vague description. They never filled it. People kept leaving. Systems kept breaking. And every so often, someone from the company would look at my LinkedIn profile, probably wondering if I'd answer if they reached out. I never did. Getting fired felt like an ending at the time, but it was. It was a reveal. They thought they were cutting loose dead weight. What they didn't know was that I had already documented the truth, protected myself, and stepped aside just in time for them to trip over their own arrogance. After 17 years, I didn't need revenge. I just needed them to learn what I already knew. Experience isn't expensive until it's gone. The email hit my inbox at 8:07 a.m. marked Quick Sync, which is corporate code for your life is about to change. 17 years at the same company teaches you how to read tone before words. No HR copied, no agenda, just my boss's name and a calendar block 10 minutes long. I didn't even finish my coffee before security badges started blinking red across the floor. That's when I knew this wasn't a discussion. It was an execution. What they didn't know was that I'd already seen the storm clouds forming weeks earlier and I'd quietly moved out of the rain. When I walked into that glass conference room, I wasn't surprised. I was prepared. They didn't bother with ceremony. My boss, Mark, sat stiffly with his hands folded like he was praying this would be quick. HR smiled the way people do when they've rehearsed empathy in a mirror. "This isn't about performance," she said, which is always the first lie. "We're restructuring." 17 years of late nights, missed birthdays, emergency calls at 2 a.m., all reduced to a bullet point in a slide deck I'd never see. I listened, nodded, even thanked them for the opportunity. That confused them. They were expecting anger, maybe tears. What they got instead was calm. Because while they were planning my exit, they'd missed something critical. I wasn't just an employee. I was the connective tissue holding 3 departments together, and I'd quietly documented every workaround, dependency, and vendor escalation that only existed in my head. And I'd already stopped sharing it. As I packed my desk under the polite watch of a security guard who wouldn't meet my eyes, my phone buzzed. A message from a vendor Mark didn't know I managed personally. Still good for the transition next week? I smiled for the first time that day. Over the past year, leadership had pushed for efficiency, which meant cutting staff while increasing output. So I'd done what any veteran does. I built parallel systems, fail-safes, and personal relationships to keep things running when budgets got tight. Those systems were never formally assigned. They were favors, and favors can be withdrawn. By the time I walked out with a cardboard box, half the company was still operating on processes no one else understood. Processes I'd quietly locked behind access only I had. The first crack appeared 2 days later. A regional operations manager called me, voice tight, asking where a certain approval workflow lived. I told him truthfully I no longer had access. Then came procurement, then IT, then a panicked voicemail from Mark himself asking if I could hop on a quick call. I didn't respond. By Friday, delays were stacking up, deliveries missed, compliance reports stalled, nothing catastrophic, yet. Just enough friction to make executives sweat. That's when the board started asking questions. Why did losing one person cause this much drag? Why weren't these systems documented? Why was no one able to untangle the mess? The answer landed like a brick. In the rush to cut costs, they'd eliminated the one person who knew how everything fit together. And worse, they'd done it without a transition. My final act wasn't sabotage, it was absence. I didn't break anything. I simply stopped holding it together. When Mark finally reached me through a mutual contact, his voice had lost its edge. He offered a consulting contract, triple my old hourly rate, short-term, urgent. I told him I'd think about it. I didn't mention that I'd already accepted another role, one where my experience was valued, my warnings taken seriously, and my institutional knowledge treated like the asset it was. On my last day of severance, the company announced a temporary slowdown due to operational challenges. 2 months later, Mark was quietly replaced. No announcement, no farewell email, just gone. I didn't celebrate. I didn't need to. Revenge doesn't always look like fireworks. Sometimes it looks like watching people finally understand the cost of arrogance. They fired me without warning, but I walked away with something far more powerful than a job. I walked away with leverage. And they learned, too late, that experience isn't something you can just delete. The email didn't even have the decency to pretend. No calendar invite, no quick catch-up, no warning signs, just a subject line that read immediate meeting HR present. 17 years collapsed into 8 words. I stared at my screen while the office buzzed around me, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, people laughing over nothing. I knew that meeting tone. Everyone who's been in corporate America long enough knows it. It's the sound of the floor dropping out from under you while everyone else keeps walking like gravity still works. I straightened my jacket, shut down my terminal, and walked to the conference room already knowing the ending they'd scripted for me. They didn't waste time. My boss, new, polished, half my age, kept his hands folded like he was practicing empathy from a handbook. HR slid the folder across the table before I'd even sat down. "We're restructuring," he said, eyes never meeting mine. "This decision is effective immediately." 17 years of building systems no one else understood, holding teams together through mergers and outages, and this was how it ended. No performance issues, no warnings, just a clean cut like trimming dead weight. I nodded slowly because anger would only give them the satisfaction they were quietly hoping for. What they didn't know was that I'd spent the last year preparing, not to leave, but to survive them. The funny thing about being invisible for years is that people stop guarding their secrets around you. I'd been the guy everyone assumed would always be there, the institutional memory, the safe pair of hands. That meant I was copied on things no one else bothered to read. Risk assessments, vendor audits, compliance exceptions signed off temporarily and never revisited. I'd flagged them, documented them, archived them because that was my job. What I never told anyone was that I'd also kept a personal timeline, dates, approvals, names, not out of paranoia, out of habit. Because when systems fail, it's never sudden. It's always because someone ignored the quiet warnings. They escorted me out with polite smiles and rehearsed condolences. I shook hands, collected my box, and walked through the lobby like a ghost. In the parking lot, instead of driving home, I sat in my car and made 3 phone calls. The first was to a compliance attorney I'd consulted months earlier just to ask questions. The second was to an external auditor who owed me a favor after I'd saved their firm from a regulatory embarrassment years back. The third was to the board's independent risk committee, whose chair had once thanked me for being the only adult in the room. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't threaten. I simply asked a question. Have you reviewed the unresolved compliance exceptions tied to our last 3 vendor migrations? By Monday morning, my former boss was in emergency meetings he didn't understand. By Wednesday, outside auditors were requesting documentation that suddenly couldn't be produced. The shortcuts I'd warned about, approved over my objections, were now center stage. The same HR rep who slid that folder across the table was suddenly emailing me, asking if I'd be available to clarify historical context. I replied once, briefly, professionally, I wasn't available, I no longer worked there. The silence that followed was louder than any argument I could have made. 2 weeks later, the board announced leadership changes. Mutual separation, the press release said. Internal sources were less kind. The restructuring paused, then reversed. A month after that, I accepted a consulting role with another firm, not them, advising companies on the exact risks my old employer had ignored. My rate was higher than my old salary, my calendar was mine again, and my phone rang daily with offers I never would have seen if I'd stayed quietly loyal. I didn't destroy them. I didn't need to. I simply stepped out of the way and let gravity do what it always does when shortcuts meet daylight. They fired me without warning, convinced I was expendable. What they didn't know was that the only thing holding their systems together wasn't my job title, it was my restraint. He fired me on a Tuesday morning like he was canceling a cable subscription. No warning, no build-up. Just a calendar invite titled Quick Sync and a glass-walled conference room where HR was already seated when I walked in. 17 years. Longer than his entire executive career. Longer than the building had existed. He didn't thank me. He didn't apologize. He just said, "We're going in a different direction," and slid a severance packet across the table as if it were generous instead of insulting. I remember noticing the hum of the HVAC, the faint smell of burnt coffee, the way my reflection looked older in the glass than I felt. And I remember thinking, not with anger but with eerie calm, you have no idea what you just triggered. Because while they thought they were cutting dead weight, I knew something they didn't. I knew how fragile their entire operation really was. I knew which systems were held together by habit instead of documentation. I knew which vendors stayed loyal out of personal trust rather than contracts. I knew which reports were automated only because I'd written the scripts myself and never taught anyone else how to fix them when they failed. For 17 years, I wasn't just doing my job. I was quietly becoming the load-bearing wall. I didn't argue in that meeting. I didn't raise my voice. I signed nothing on the spot. I asked for the weekend to review the paperwork, shook hands, and walked out carrying a cardboard box that felt lighter than it should have. People avoided eye contact. A few whispered, "I'm sorry." One junior analyst looked terrified, like he'd just watched a magic trick go wrong. I went home, sat at my kitchen table, and opened my laptop, not the company one, but my personal machine, the one with backups, notes, and records going back over a decade. That's when I checked something I had suspected for years but never needed to confirm until now. They had been using my framework under a licensing assumption that was never finalized. It wasn't malicious at first. Years ago, during a rushed expansion, legal told me they'd circle back on formalizing ownership of the optimization engine I built to manage cross-regional operations. We were busy. Revenue was exploding. Everyone trusted everyone. That circle never closed. Then leadership changed. Then priorities shifted. Then people like me became line items instead of partners. But the paperwork never caught up with reality. And the new executives, especially the one who fired me, never bothered to understand the foundation they were standing on. I spent that weekend not panicking, not plotting, but documenting. Calmly, precisely. I pulled contracts, emails, change logs, vendor communications where my name, not the company's, was listed as the technical authority. I called an old friend in corporate law, not to threaten, not to bluff, just to ask one question. Hypothetically, what happens if a company terminates the only individual authorized to maintain compliance on a system they don't fully own? He laughed once. Then he stopped laughing. By Monday morning, my former employer was already feeling the edges of the problem. A routine audit request came in. A vendor paused a renewal, asking for confirmation from the usual contact. An automated process failed quietly, then loudly. By Wednesday, my phone started ringing. First my old manager, then HR, then someone from legal who suddenly wanted to clarify a few things. I let everything go to voicemail, not out of spite, but because leverage only works if you don't rush it. On Thursday afternoon, I finally replied. 1 email, 3 sentences, polite, professional. I explained that since I was no longer employed, I could no longer attest to or support systems developed under my independent authority. I added that I was, however, available for consultation under a standard independent contractor agreement. My rate was listed clearly at the bottom. An hour later, they called an emergency board meeting. By Friday, the executive who fired me was no longer speaking in absolutes. By the following Tuesday, he wasn't speaking for the company at all. They brought me back in, not as an employee, not with a badge, not with a title, but as the person who understood the machine well enough to keep it from tearing itself apart. I walked into the same building, sat in the same conference room, and watched people listen to me again, really listen. Not because they suddenly respected me, but because now they understood the cost of not doing so. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my rate mid-meeting. I didn't even mention the firing. I did the work. I stabilized the systems. I documented everything they had ignored. And when the contract ended, I left on my own terms, with my reputation intact and my calendar full of companies that had heard what happened and didn't want to repeat it. 17 years taught me something no severance package ever could. Loyalty is only invisible until it's gone. And when you fire someone without knowing what they carry, you don't just lose an employee, you lose the quiet knowledge that was keeping your world upright. They thought they were done with me. They didn't realize I was the thing holding them together. By the time the meeting ended, the room felt smaller, like the air had been quietly siphoned out. My manager avoided my eyes. HR slid a folder across the table without ceremony. 17 years reduced to a severance packet and a rehearsed speech about organizational realignment. No warning, no performance plan, no explanation beyond budget pressures and strategic direction. I shook hands, thanked them for their time, and walked out carrying nothing but my phone and the calm certainty that they'd just made the most expensive mistake of their careers. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I wasn't just an employee. I was the keystone. Over nearly 2 decades, I'd become the institutional memory they never bothered to document properly. I knew which vendors could actually deliver during shortages, which clauses in our contracts would snap if pulled the wrong way, which systems were held together by custom patches no one else understood. I also knew something else, something far more consequential. The company's biggest client renewal hinged on a compliance certification I personally maintained. My name wasn't just on the documentation, it was on the authorization itself. I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't delete files or burn bridges. I simply stopped doing work I was no longer employed to do. At midnight, my credentials expired. At 8:07 a.m. the next morning, alerts started firing. A compliance sync failed. A vendor flagged an anomaly. The client's risk team asked for confirmation from the authorized maintainer, me. Legal scrambled. It escalated. Management panicked. By noon, the renewal call was postponed pending clarification. By close of business, the stock dipped on rumors. My phone rang, then rang again. Voicemails stacked up. My former boss, HR, the VP who'd never learned my name until that day. They offered to talk, to clarify, to fix the misunderstanding. I listened to none of it. Instead, I forwarded a single email to their legal department, a clean timeline, a copy of the authorization terms, and a note explaining that any further inquiries should go through my consultant, effective immediately. My rate was attached. It was fair. It was firm. It was non-negotiable. 2 days later, we met again, same room, different posture. Apologies replaced platitudes. The folder was thicker this time. They needed me back, but not as an employee. They needed my signature, my knowledge, my calm. I agreed to a short-term engagement that cost more than my old salary would have in a year. The renewal went through. The crisis evaporated. The company survived. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt validated. 17 years had taught me something simple and dangerous to ignore. Loyalty without respect is just convenience. When they decided I was expendable, they forgot the quiet truth beneath the org chart, that some people aren't line items. They're load-bearing walls. I walked away when the contract ended, head high, future intact. And this time, when the door closed behind me, it didn't echo. It clicked, clean, final, and earned.